Hello everyone, today we're going over lipids. Lipids are one of the four classes of macromolecules, as highlighted here. Now lipids are unique because of their structure. Lipids form a long hydrocarbon tail, as seen right here. These long hydrocarbon tails are extremely nonpolar and they repel water. This is really important because they act differently than the other macromolecules. Now, as seen here, we have what's called a saturated fatty acid, and here we have what's called an unsaturated fatty acid. Saturated fatty acids mean that in this long chain of carbons and hydrogens, each carbon has the maximum amount of bonds to hydrogen that it can have. So let's take this carbon, for example. It's bound to a carbon here and a carbon here to keep the chain going, and then the two other bonds which it's capable of making are each to another hydrogen. Now let's look at this right here, which is called an unsaturated fatty acid. An unsaturated fatty acid means that it does not have the maximum amount of bonds to hydrogen. So see right here, we have a double bond between two carbons. Now let's say that this double bond were to break and you were to have a single bond right here. Each one of these carbons would then have 3 bonds, and it would need to have one more bond. Now normally this extra bond would be taken up by a hydrogen, right? So as you can see here, it would be possible to make more bonds to hydrogen, which is why it's called unsaturated. Now within unsaturated fatty acids you have monounsaturated and polyunsaturated. Monounsaturated means you have one place in which there could be more bonds to hydrogen, or in our case a double bond. Polyunsaturated means there can be multiple places or multiple double bonds where there could be more bonds to hydrogen. Now another thing that makes lipids really unique compared to the other macromolecules is that this is the only macromolecule which is called non-polymeric. This means that these molecules do not make polymers. What are polymers? Polymers are long chains of repeating units. An easy example of this would be in carbohydrates. Glucose bonds to itself to make glycogen. It's long chains of individual glucose molecules which come together to make one giant molecule which is stored for energy in our body. Lipids do not have the capability of doing this. They will always exist as one of these main types. They don't bond to each other and form these long chains. You have these individual chains which like to pack together to avoid water. Now, there are 3 main roles of lipids. The first of these is membranes. Lipids make up the membranes of each one of our cells. This is really important for cellular processes in maintaining concentration gradients. The second role of lipids is energy storage. These long hydrocarbon chains are what you call highly reduced, meaning it has the maximum amounts of bonds to hydrogen. Our body makes energy by oxidizing this or breaking bonds to hydrogen and forming bonds to oxygen instead. So as you can imagine, each one of these bonds to hydrogen stores a lot of energy and can be broken to release it. Now the third thing that lipids can do is what are called signaling molecules. A lot of hormones and steroids in our bodies are made up of lipids. One example of this is cholesterol. You'll often hear it's a cholesterol-derived hormone. That means that it's some form of cholesterol, which is this ring structure form of a lipid, which is used to make these signaling molecules. Now there are 4 different types of lipids: fatty acids, triglycerides, phospholipids, and cholesterol. These 4 can be seen over here on the right. Fatty acids and triglycerides are pretty similar. A free fatty acid just means you have a long hydrocarbon chain attached to something polar on the end, like this, a couple of oxygens. Now a triglyceride means that you have 3 of these fatty acids connected together in what they call a glycerol backbone. All you need to know is tri means 3, and you have 3 fatty acids connected together on this backbone. Phospholipids is 2 fatty acids connected to a backbone, which then has a phosphate group. This phosphate group is negatively charged. which means it's more likely to be attracted to water compared to the long nonpolar tails. Cholesterol is the last form of these lipids. Cholesterol is what you call these ring structures, where you can see these carbons form rings. It's the only form of lipids that does this. Now, as you can see, it's still very nonpolar. The only polar place is this oxygen here. The rest of this is all carbons and hydrogens, which are nonpolar bonds, making all of this very, very nonpolar and repelling water. Now, here is what we have is what is called the phospholipid bilayer. This is what our cell membranes look like. You have each one of these phospholipids, which is a phosphopolar head, the hydrophilic head, it's attracted to water, and you have these hydrophobic tails, which repel water. Now, on the outside and the inside of the cell, there's a lot of water. So, the phosphate heads align to interact with water, while the tails repel water, and so they collect together on the inside here, so that they don't have to touch or interact with water at all. Here we have a closer look of another phospholipid, just so that you can see what it looks like. We have our fatty acids right here connected to some sort of backbone. Here, in our cells it's a glycerol backbone, which then has a phosphate head. As you can see, there's a negative charge on the oxygen right here, making it likely to interact with water. Now, let's bring in our analogy. I like to think of the cell membrane as like a concert. You have all of these phospholipids, or people at a concert, all packed together. As you can see here, we have a picture of a concert. All the people are really packed together. This is also kind of what a cell membrane would look like. Most of the phospholipids are like this, and then you'll have some intermembrane protein sticking out in order to interact with things on the outside. Hence the hands sticking up in the air. I like to think of the people's heads like the phosphate head group on the phospholipid, and the tails on the phospholipid like the people's legs. Now, you could kind of think of it as if they were standing on a mirror, then that would be where you would get the second group right here to make the bilayer. But either way, I think you get the idea. Now, these phospholipids and lipids in general interact with each other by forming van der Waals interactions. These van der Waals interactions are relatively weak. What they do is form interactions with each other just because of the electrons that are held within the entire molecule. They're able to slide past each other, and this model is often called a fluid mosaic model because the cell membrane is not stiff. The cell membrane is very likely to move around. Now, as we see in our saturated fatty acids and unsaturated fatty acids, these form van der Waals with each other. So let's say that we have a bunch of saturated fatty acids interacting with one another. This molecule is very long and straight. It can stack on top of each other very symmetrically, almost like stacking boxes or stacking anything that would be together really well, almost like Tetris. Now, this symmetrical form can form van der Waals interactions really, really well with itself. So, when you have these strong interactions, it takes more energy to break them. So, at room temperature, saturated fatty acids will be solid. That's things like butter. Now, unsaturated fatty acids, they have this kink in the backbone. They don't fit as well together, and they can't make van der Waals interactions together as well. This means at room temperature, they're going to be more liquid. This would be things like olive oil. Now, like we said, just to make this clear again, van der Waals interactions are not super strong. They can be broken easily. Think about melting butter. You could hold butter in your hand and it would start melting. Now, these phospholipids can easily slide past each other and jump around. Everybody at a concert is going to be jumping around and sliding past each other and interacting with one another. Think of that as your van der Waals interactions. And that's about it.